ever competitive?
Oh, you kidding? Yeah. So we would compete with each other. He'd do a line, and then I'd try and make it go somewhere better. And we talked about it. He'd go, right, got to write something better than that. We actually spent a lot of time together laughing. And for me, that's what I remember.
Paul McCartney once said a certain band's album made him feel physically ill because it was that good. And no, it wasn't the Rolling Stones. From groundbreaking harmonies to modern genre benders, today we're diving into the bands that blew McCartney's mind. Some you'd expect, others you absolutely won't. Number 1. The Beach Boys. Imagine hearing an album so masterfully produced. It makes one of the Beatles rethink everything. That's exactly what happened when Paul McCartney heard Pet Sounds. He was floored. Paul didn't just like the Beach Boys, he studied them. In countless interviews, he cited Brian Wilson's melodic genius as one of his greatest inspirations. God Only Knows, McCartney once said, is the greatest song ever written. Period. That's not light praise coming from the man who helped write Let It Be and Hey Jude. The real shocker? Pet Sounds directly inspired Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Paul heard it and knew they had to step up their game. That competition sparked what many call the most creative era in Beatles history. The Beatles and Beach Boys never battled. It was mutual admiration. Paul even invited Brian Wilson to share the stage at a benefit concert. In McCartney's musical world, the Beach Boys weren't just a surf pop act. They were architects of harmony, texture, and innovation. Number 2. Radiohead. You probably don't picture Paul McCartney vibing to Kid A or OK Computer. But surprise, he absolutely rates Radiohead as one of the greatest modern bands. And he means it. Paul's gone on record praising their brilliant originality, admiring how they reinvent themselves with every album. To him, Radiohead isn't just music, they're evolution. He once remarked that they remind him of what the Beatles wanted to be, unafraid to challenge fans while pushing sonic boundaries. What makes this connection even more intriguing is how different their sounds are. Paul grew up on skiffle and Motown, while Radiohead bathed in abstraction and alienation. Yet somehow, that creative courage resonated with him. He even praised Thom Yorke's vocal choices and the band's risk-taking. They go places other bands fear to tread, he said, and that's everything. Number 3. Nirvana. Here's a musical moment that sounds like fan fiction, but actually happened. Paul McCartney once fronted Nirvana. No, not in a tribute. In real life. In 2012, for a charity concert, Dave Grohl called Paul to fill in for Kurt Cobain. The surviving members of Nirvana, Grohl, Chris Novoselic, and Pat Smear, asked him to be their frontman. The result? A blistering original called Cut Me Some Slack that won a Grammy. The chemistry? Raw, loud, surreal. But McCartney's respect for Nirvana started long before that collaboration. He admired their energy, their emotional punch, and how they brought rawness back to rock. In interviews, he said their music reminded him of the rebellious spark that ignited the Beatles in the first place. And while their sounds couldn't be more different, Kurt's anguished growl versus Paul's melodic smoothness, McCartney saw something deeper, truth. Nirvana's music, to him, was unapologetically real. That mattered more than polish or precision. Here's the wild duality. The man behind Yesterday saw himself in the band that screamed lithium. Number 4. The Everly Brothers. Before Lennon and McCartney were Lennon-McCartney, they were just two teenagers harmonizing like the Everly Brothers. Paul has never been shy about where his and John's vocal chemistry came from. He said flat out, "We were trying to be the Everly Brothers." That tight, soaring two-part harmony, directly borrowed from Don and Phil Everly. The Beatles even covered Crying in the Rain and Bye Bye Love in their early sets. Paul called their voices magical and admitted to practicing Everly-style harmonies until he and John could blend like twins. It wasn't just influence, it was blueprint. In later years, McCartney shared a deeply emotional connection with Don Everly. When Phil passed away in 2014, Paul wrote a heartfelt tribute, saying the brothers were the best. That's all he needed to say. Here's a powerful twist. Paul once said that without the Everly Brothers, the Beatles' vocal style wouldn't exist. Number 5. Steely Dan. Paul McCartney has a deep admiration for bands that chase perfection, and few bands epitomize that better than Steely Dan. Known for their meticulous studio craftsmanship and complex songwriting, Steely Dan represented something Paul always valued: the pursuit of musical excellence. In interviews, McCartney has praised their ability to weave jazz chords, pop hooks, and sardonic lyrics into something fresh and timeless. He once noted that bands like Steely Dan weren't just making music, they were crafting it like fine art. And as someone who spent weeks perfecting tracks like Penny Lane and Eleanor Rigby, Paul instantly recognized that obsessive genius. Steely Dan's albums, especially Aya and The Royal Scam, struck him as masterclasses in arrangement. Their sound was sophisticated but never sterile. Each note had purpose. Every groove felt alive. That kind of deliberate artistry mirrored the Beatles' own approach to recording. The takeaway here? Perfection isn't about overthinking, it's about intention. Steely Dan reminded Paul that music can be smart and soulful, polished and playful. If you want to hear what Paul considers a blueprint for studio excellence, start with Aya. It's a sonic education. Number 6. Foo Fighters. When Paul McCartney played drums for the Foo Fighters on Sunday Rain, fans were shocked, but Paul wasn't. He's been a fan of Dave Grohl's band for years. In fact, he's praised the Foo Fighters as one of the few modern rock bands keeping the spirit of classic rock alive. Paul and Grohl share a deep friendship, born out of mutual respect. Grohl has openly called Paul a mentor, while McCartney admires how the Foo Fighters channel raw, melodic energy, qualities that defined the Beatles at their peak. In interviews, Paul has complimented the band's consistency. "They're real musicians," he once said. "They play hard and care about the songs." That might sound simple, but in an age of overproduced tracks, it's a rare compliment from a Beatle. The wild duality. Paul, a pioneer of pop experimentation, loves a band that thrives on rock purity. Number 7. Led Zeppelin. For years, fans assumed there was some quiet rivalry between the Beatles and Led Zeppelin. After all, they were two titans of rock, one elegant, one thunderous. But in truth, Paul McCartney admired Zeppelin deeply. Paul once said that when he first heard "Whole Lotta Love," it knocked him sideways. He respected how Led Zeppelin fused blues, folk, and hard rock into something primal and magnetic. More importantly, he admired how they carved their own space without chasing trends. They were the trend. And despite the Beatles and Zeppelin rarely crossing paths publicly, there was mutual respect behind the scenes. Paul even tried to book John Bonham for a wing session. Bonham showed up uninvited and ready to play, proving how much the feeling was mutual. What Paul appreciated most wasn't just the sound, it was the fearlessness. Zeppelin didn't water down their vision to play it safe. They went big, got weird, and trusted their instincts. Number 8. Oasis. When Oasis exploded in the 90s, their Beatles obsession was no secret. From sound to swagger, the Gallagher brothers wore their influence on their sleeves. And while that cocky bravado rubbed some the wrong way, McCartney wasn't one of them. He actually applauded it. Paul once said he was flattered by the comparisons and even joked that Oasis were the next Beatles, until they weren't. But don't mistake the humor for dismissiveness. Paul acknowledged their anthemic songwriting, their massive choruses, and their ability to unite a generation. In fact, he praised Definitely Maybe and What's the Story, Morning Glory as proper records, admiring how Noel Gallagher revived melodic guitar rock with fresh energy. Paul saw Oasis not as copycats, but as torchbearers. Number 9. The Rolling Stones. For decades, media tried to pit the Beatles and the Rolling Stones against each other. Lennon versus Jagger, melody versus grit. But McCartney never bought into the rivalry, and always respected the Stones' swagger and staying power. Sure, Paul's poked fun at them a few times, calling them a blues cover band in a cheeky interview. But if you look past the jokes, you'll find a long history of admiration. Paul has repeatedly praised Mick Jagger's stage presence, calling him the best frontman in rock, and highlighted Keith Richards' guitar instincts as pure magic. What stands out most is the Stones' longevity. McCartney once said he admired how they kept it going, still packing arenas with that gritty rock and roll edge. Coming from a man who helped define pop perfection, that's high praise. There's also real camaraderie. McCartney and Jagger have performed together, partied together, and exchanged musical ideas behind the scenes. Paul even said that when the Beatles were coming up, they'd look to the Stones to see what was next. Sometimes, the student became the teacher. Number 10. Queen. If you want to know how Paul McCartney felt about Queen, just watch his face when he talks about Freddie Mercury. His admiration glows. Paul has often praised Queen's intricate harmonies, theatrical flair, and unfiltered passion. Freddie could do anything, he once said. He was just brilliant. And it wasn't just Freddie. Paul appreciated how Queen pushed musical boundaries. Songs like Bohemian Rhapsody and Somebody to Love felt like they belonged in an opera house, but rocked stadiums. That kind of ambition struck a deep chord with McCartney, who had once led the Beatles through Abbey Road and the White Album. Paul even said that Queen reminded him of what the Beatles aimed for in their later years, artistry with no limits. He admired their courage to blend genres, switch tempos mid-song, and turn ballads into anthems. Number 11. David Bowie. Paul McCartney didn't just respect David Bowie, he cherished him. In fact, Paul has called Bowie a great original, someone who brought theater, danger, and brilliance to every note. Their friendship spanned decades, and McCartney's tributes after Bowie's death were heartfelt and poetic. Paul admired Bowie's chameleon-like creativity, his ability to shift personas without ever losing his core. Ziggy Stardust, the Thin White Duke, Major Tom. To McCartney, Bowie wasn't just a rock star. He was a living art installation. Each reinvention showed what it meant to be fearless in your craft. Behind the scenes, they were close. The two collaborated on charity work, shared studio stories, and bonded over a deep love for pushing boundaries. McCartney once said Bowie had a restless mind, the kind of brain that never stopped composing, questioning, and transforming. And while their music didn't overlap often, Paul clearly saw in Bowie a kindred spirit, someone who used the platform of fame not just to entertain, but to evolve culture itself. Number 12. Bob Dylan. When Bob Dylan played the Beatles' The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan in 1964, it hit Paul McCartney like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just folk music, it was poetry with a guitar. Paul later said Dylan showed them it was okay to get real, to write about things that mattered instead of just love and heartbreak. Dylan's lyrical boldness nudged the Beatles toward introspection. Without Dylan, songs like Norwegian Wood or Eleanor Rigby might never have existed. Paul openly credits Dylan with changing the way we wrote. That's a monumental statement coming from one of the most prolific songwriters alive. They met, they smoked, they vibed. Dylan allegedly introduced the Fab Four to weed. True or not, the cultural exchange was powerful. Dylan wasn't flashy, but he was fearless. Paul respected that immensely. Over the years, Paul has consistently hailed Dylan as a revolutionary force. Even when Dylan won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2016, McCartney was among the first to say, "He deserves it. He's our greatest living poet." Number 13. The Byrds. The Beatles inspired the Byrds, but the love definitely went both ways, especially from Paul McCartney. He was an early fan of their jangly, 12-string Rickenbacker sound, especially the work of Roger McGuinn. And that admiration? It flowed directly into Beatles records. George Harrison admitted that If I Needed Someone was heavily inspired by the Byrds' The Bells of Rhymney. And McCartney? He loved their ability to blend folk and rock into something emotionally rich, but rhythmically modern. Paul praised how the Byrds took Dylan's lyrics and electrified them. It wasn't just influence, it was alchemy. He respected their courage to evolve, to go psychedelic, and to follow sonic paths others feared to tread. That kind of bravery struck a chord with him. There's even evidence that the Byrds' blend of Americana and British pop shaped parts of Rubber Soul, a record that's often seen as the Beatles' turning point into deeper songwriting. That's not coincidence. That's cross-pollination at its finest. From barbershop-style harmonies to arena-shaking rock gods, the bands Paul McCartney loved aren't just musical favorites. They're the blueprint of modern sound. They shaped his genius, and in return, he helped shape ours. If you enjoyed this deep dive into McCartney's influences, just wait till we reveal the guitarists he couldn't stand. That video's coming soon. Don't miss it.